Welcome, everyone. Ahlan wa sahlan. I think we'll get started. There's no more people in the waiting room. Thank you all for joining us today for the first session of the online seminar series, Revolution in Philosophy. We're excited to be organizing it and hosting you with us in this virtual room. For those who don't know me, I am Aline Khouri, a managing director of Dar Yusuf Nasri Jasser for Art and Research, an independent artist-led space in Bethlehem in the Palestinian territories. I'm joined by one of my colleagues, Emily Jasser, who is somewhere around there in the boxes. Pre-COVID, we used to hold all our activities and programs on site in Bethlehem, hosting artists and scholars and residents who came to Palestine, creating partnerships, exchanges, friendships with the local community, organizing dance and educational workshops, seminars, talks, and film screenings. Unfortunately, there have been a lot of restrictions on travel in the last 2 years, and we shifted some of our programs online to continue these conversations and exchanges. And it also allowed us to reach to such large and international audiences, to include the diaspora who can't make it to Palestine. As an artist-led space, we invite and welcome artists, creatives, scholars, students, anyone really, to organize programs together and use our space as a platform. So today we are honored to be hosting Philosophy Workshop, and particularly Malak Afouneh, who organized and curated this fabulous online series. Philosophy Workshop is a voluntary, independent, self-organized initiative in Palestine that organizes public workshops and interactive lectures on philosophical topics. The initiative focuses on introducing philosophical ways of thinking of contemporary issues and aims to make philosophical knowledge accessible for the public. Malak Afouneh is a faculty member in the Department of Philosophy and Cultural Studies at Birzeit University. She completed her MA degree in Literature and Philosophy from the University of Sussex and is the founder of Philosophy Workshop. Before I hand over to Malak, a few just technical remarks. The session is being recorded for documentation purposes and to be uploaded online. So just so everyone is aware. We're also a small team, so please bear with us if there are any technical issues and write in the chat box to inform us of any problems or anything. We wanted to keep the conversation on a Zoom meeting and not a webinar, so there would be a sense of closeness and allow guests to participate and engage. So feel free to turn on your video so we can see you, and we'll have a Q&A in the end. So you're welcome to participate, the questions, and a discussion. I think that is all. So I am going to pass on to Malak to present the program and today's session with Denis.
Thank you, Aline. First of all, I want to thank Dar Jasser actually for hosting these sessions and helping out with the logistics. Thank you so much. And welcome everyone to our launching session of Revolutionary in Philosophy. I won't take a lot of time. Actually, I know that nobody's here to listen to introductions, and we are all excited to discover what a revolutionary organization is with Denis. But I just have a few words to say about Philosophy Workshop project itself and about this specific topic, revolution in philosophy. So actually, I have started this initiative a few years ago to provide a kind of space where we can publicly learn some philosophical ideas, maybe outside the the academic institution that is unfortunately not accessible for everyone. And we also are doing this voluntarily. So the idea is to prove that we still can share and circulate this kind of very specialized and complicated knowledge freely, and without having to be subjugated to the universal abstract unit. In other words, without the mediation of money, and also without the institutional bureaucratic burden So having this mentioned, I really, really want to thank Dennis and the other speakers who will be with us on Friday and Monday for accepting my invitation and for joining us also voluntarily as a kind of support, at least in the way that I like to understand it, as a kind of support to the idea of the project itself and to Palestine and to everyone who's curious about the revolution in philosophy. So we will be exploring this theme of revolution in philosophy, or maybe in different philosophies over the course of 3 sessions. So today is our first session, but we also have another session on Friday with Adam Bartlett, and that will start at 12 p.m. Jerusalem time. And we also have Rebecca Kome on Monday, and she will be with us at 5 p.m. also Jerusalem time. So I'm really glad that you made it to today's session, but make sure that you don't miss the coming sessions as well. Let me introduce you, Dennis, before you start your talk. So Denis Yao, guys, is a software developer. He's a philosopher who's interested in the intersections of political economy, political organizations, and mathematics. He's part of a group studying these topics that's called the subset of theoretical practice. And he is also on the editorial committee of the journal Crisis and the Critique. Let me actually share a link of their website with you so you can dig it in if you want. And I highly, highly recommend that you follow these smart guys to keep an eye on the most important contemporary philosophical debates. Denis is also the co-author of the book Hegel, Lacan, Zizek. Denis will be presenting for 30 minutes before we open the discussion for everyone. So please take your notes and keep your comments and questions until Denis is done with his presentation. And make sure that you don't run away during these 30 minutes because we're looking forward to a heated discussion afterward. I think it's the time for me to shut up and pass it to you, Denis. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Malak, and thank you to the organizers. It's a big honor for me to be here. I completely love this mission to make philosophy accessible outside of the academic constraints. And I think our group, STP, or the subset of theoretical practice, we try to do this also. So, what I'm presenting today is kind of a distillation or a summary of some of the work we've been doing. And I'm going to kind of present it at a very high level. So there are a lot of details that, probably don't fit in a 30-minute talk, but I'm definitely open to discussing further after the talk. And so if you find anything that is interesting to you, but I didn't touch on enough, please bring it up. Can you see my screen okay? Presentation? Okay, perfect. All right. So the title of this talk is What is a Revolutionary Organization? And the subtitle is And What Can Modern Political Struggles Learn from the Sciences and Philosophy? So if you are a little bit skeptical of the second question, I completely understand. I'm also skeptical. What can politics learn from science and philosophy? I think that is a very loaded question, but I put it there just for, to create a little bit of controversy for us to maybe hash out in the discussion. Okay, so my talk today shares a premise with the early Soviet thinker Alexander Bogdanov that we can view each of the sciences as specializations of the science of organization. This most general science is what Bogdanov termed techtology. I want to consider how technology opens a bridge between those objects of science which are universally recognizable on the one hand, and social processes whose very existence is contested on the other. Many political movements fall into the latter category. Their claim to legitimacy is not pre-given, but is part of the stakes of their struggle, in contrast to natural phenomena. And yet, we can recognize that such movements have what may be called a life world of their own. This life world has all the elements of what engages its participants, which actively transform the line between possible and impossible, and serves as a resource for those who partake in it. At the very least, we see this imprinted on individuals or on the individual level as a deep subjective change of one kind or another, even if it is difficult to trace the movement's more structural effects. However, we want to pose the following technological question. What are the forms generated within a political movement which are irreducible to individual experience? Why is this a good technological question? Because with technology, we can avoid the traditional split between subjective and objective aspects of phenomena. Bogdanov usually calls this the division between psychic and physical. And we can directly consider how most interesting phenomena, especially in politics, are composites of both. This means that we can include among a thing's properties how it is perceived by a subject. There is nothing which stops us from considering how a political body, such as a nation, with all the intricacies of its historical self-conception or self-deception, can be viewed as an organism with a reproductive cycle that includes both ideological and material components. So we can count among the real effects of a movement, not only changes to our material conditions, but also the capacity for this movement to shift ideological parameters of a given situation. In this sense, technology is a strange short circuit. It's a strange short circuit between the neutral scientific modeling of natural phenomena and the subjectively charged perspective of politics, which has inherent creative potential. Here we have a quote by Bogdanov, where he kind of outlines the basic idea of technology, right? Which is to join the struggle of against nature with the struggle of society itself, right? Social forces. So I'll just read this quote. The self-organization of mankind is a struggle with its own internal and biological and social primordial forces. For this, mankind needs tools just as much as for its struggle with external nature, although different tools, namely the instruments of organization. And later on, he lists some of these instruments. So the first one would be the word, right? We use words to organize ourselves socially. Next would be the idea, right? We all, in order to have a political movement, you need an idea to guide you. And finally, you have social norms. So what are after the revolution, what are the norms that you need to set up to make the revolution sustainable? These are the kind of ideas. And Bogdanov himself was, for a little bit of historical context, he was one of the co-founders of the Bolshevik Party, along with Lenin. He was ousted by Lenin, basically over some theoretical disputes, right? Lenin wrote a book criticizing Bogdanov, and Bogdanov left the Bolshevik Party, but he remained an important figure in the Soviet avant-garde for long after. Okay. So what exactly is the role of such a science when it comes to political practice? When we invoke science, it often seems like we are in danger of falling into an idealist trap of demanding a complete and scientifically accurate picture of a political struggle before engaging in it. Even worse, such a science may evoke Gilles Deleuze's notions of societies of control, of social regulation through scientific and automated processes rather than direct coercion, or in today's language, control through surveillance. Technology certainly encompasses both traditional scientific knowledge production and control systems, since they are forms of organization. But I think it does not require that we reduce politics in general to these types of systems. Political organizing is not primarily about modeling and predicting behaviors of individuals and things. Rather, we should see it as a sequence of experiments that allow us to learn about social reality as we are perturbing or changing that reality. Our intuition here is that we have to view social situations at the right resolution in order to gain useful information about them. Just as we need a microscope to view biological entities at different levels, politics is about constructing new ways of seeing or sensing social entities. Here, just to give a couple words on, we have the calcium imaging of neuron activity in a mouse's brain. I'm using this kind of metaphorically as, imagine social reality is dark. We don't see most of it. It is only by adding stimulus to society, like perturbations, that we can light up regions of society, of social reality. And these regions might be connected in ways that are counterintuitive or not apparent to the dominant order, right? So contrast this with the science of optimization or of modeling. There's obviously some overlap, right? Modeling reality is also about experimenting and finding how it works. But in politics, we are trying to explore this reality so that we can change it, not simply so that we can understand it and control it. Okay. A system which seeks to control some aspect of society will attempt to model it in some way, but this entails classifying a significant portion of its inputs as noise. Noise does not necessarily mean unstructured. It only means that the system in question has no use for it. This allows the possibility that we can collectively bring into existence those forms which exceed the predicative and therefore predictive power of these control systems. These would be the forms that remain unindividuated within the dominant models, since these models always rely on a particular spatialized logic in order to distinguish individuals in the first place. Here we can apply one of the primary assumptions of technology, that a completely disorganized entity is impossible. A movement is always organized, even if it is not yet fully individuated and coherent. This form of organization is not reducible to the collection of individual people that belong to it. It also comprises the set of legal, economic, and communitarian connections that these movements allow. And these connections are not only those which emerge locally, where these movements take place, but may percolate unexpectedly throughout different situations. When the latter happens, we are able to gain new information about the global structures which support social reality. So what do we mean by organization here? First, we can characterize it in very general terms, so organizations in general, and then specify it for political organizations. An organization is something which possesses some kind of internal dynamics, meaning that it changes over time, as well as interaction with its environment. And this environment can be taken as another form of organization. Additionally, every organized fragment is made of other organized fragments, and therefore its internal dynamics are at least partially determined by the dynamics of its component parts and how they interact. So organization involves not only dynamics and interaction, but also composition. And we will further unpack these terms later in the text. So for now, we can just say that all forms of organization involve these three parts. They change, they interact, and they are composed of other subsystems or other forms of organization. This applies to both natural and political forms. There are at least two benefits to the technological approach. First, we can import ideas from the study of natural forms into thinking political organizations. In certain cases, this means we can borrow or translate ideas from the various sciences. But in itself, this is not new, since economics and the social sciences have a long tradition of building models of human behavior using ideas from mathematical physics, for example. However, these traditions generally privilege the human individual as a basic unit or black box of the social world. Whereas we want to start with an assemblage of human and non-human parts. So the level that we're looking at social reality, it's not necessarily at the level of individuals and then building up from that, but rather choosing a different resolution, as we were saying. So also, these sciences must remain neutral and separate from the phenomena that they study in order to produce universally verifiable knowledge. Whereas political practice produces a form of knowledge which is, at least in the moment, only available to the partisans. This is related to the second benefit of technology, which is to allow us to think of organizations themselves as experiments. If we consider political movements as producing new connections in the world, then this involves a certain set of hypotheses about how things are already connected on the one hand, and what new connections may be viable on the other. Political struggle can then be viewed as attempts to validate or invalidate these hypotheses. And as this political process continues, it refines the set of questions that are relevant, carving out a new space in the existing world for new types of organizations to develop. There are intrinsic and extrinsic properties of an organization. An extrinsic property is based on the set of external obstacles such that to overcome these obstacles, it is necessary to become organized. So state violence, ecological or economic disasters, a pandemic, and so on, are examples of external phenomena that are explicitly treated by organizations which derive their existence from treating these, right? But simply defining the organization in terms of what it opposes or attempts to mitigate is not enough to achieve a full description. There are many ways to organize. And in the case of organizing people, there are many decisions that need to be made to produce a coherent response to the outside world. Politics begins when it is possible to disagree about the ways of organizing. In other words, it is part of the intrinsic properties of organization. More generally, the intrinsic definition contains the properties which are not fully determined by the external environment. So the next question becomes, how do these intrinsic properties come to be determined if not by external pressure? In the case of biological systems, intrinsic properties can be traced out by random mutations and, on a larger scale, genetic drift. In the case of social systems, some properties are the object of decision, a charter or constitution, for example. However, more often than not, these properties develop without the conscious awareness of individuals. The legal system of a country, for example, is full of unacknowledged omissions, and contradictions, which are subsequently revealed by new cases. We can go further in this direction with Slavoj Žižek's concept of ideology as the set of sedimented implicit rules which govern everyday life, rules which may cease to function when they become explicit. A lesson of 20th century leftist movements is that such intrinsic determinations, which live within human activity itself, are decisive. Not only do we lack a theory for understanding such ideological phenomena as Žižek maintains, but we also do not recognize organizations as a space for ideological experimentation. As individuals, we are generally unable to perceive the structures which produce intrinsic determinations such as ideology. We may produce theories, but the boundaries of these theories are fuzzy and contested. There is not necessarily a global neutral standpoint to evaluate an ideology, for example, right? Because you're already in ideology, so you can't step away and evaluate it, much like a scientific approach might approach like a natural phenomena, where there is that separation. So often these theories about ideology, they appear much later, after the organization itself has disappeared. This is famously depicted by Hegel's Owl of Minerva, right? We only know about the organization after it's gone. And that is because these are theories for us as individuals outside of the organization. And these are important, but we ought to also be interested in how an organization can explore these intrinsic determinations as they develop in themselves. To answer this question, we do need a theory, not about the causal mechanisms of history, but about the nature of experimentation for organizations in general. So I don't have time in this talk to delve completely into this theory, but I want to offer a high-level approach, which my group and I have designated as phenomenological political economy. Phenomenology is simply the science of appearances, and it means we count appearances as having their own existence and logic. So whatever appears, we take it as real, we take it as having a logic and a type of existence that is appropriate for it. We start from the assumption that things appear to organizations themselves. In other words, an organization is able to sense its environment, even when individuals within that organization cannot. This may seem like an anthropomorphic error at best and a drastic metaphysical claim at worst. But when we consider sense in a non-human way as just the name for a relationship between systems that share something in common, I believe it becomes a useful approach to political problems. A fundamental example here is the way in which capitalist firms sense surplus value. Why do we say it is the firm or the business that senses and not the managers or the owners of that company? Because even if one were to replace the managers of a company, we know that the next ones will do the same things, perhaps even more efficiently, right? As Marx already noted, capitalism is not found in individual psychology. It is rather a systemic constraint on our behavior. Another example is when a candidate for political office is compelled to adopt effectively the same policies as his or her predecessor, even when it seems to go against his or her campaign promises. One can ascribe this to corruption and so on, but I claim the core issue is phenomenological. An organization can only interact with what it sees, even when that disagrees with what is apparent to individuals. So a state that sees only GDP, military power, territory, and so on will only be able to act on the basis of those variables, even if its leaders promise otherwise. So we can now use these ideas intrinsic versus extrinsic determinations, and organizational sensibility to discuss revolutionary organizations. It may seem obvious that a revolutionary organization seeks to change society at some fundamental level. According to the phenomenological approach, this implies that the revolutionary organization perceives something which society itself does not perceive. In other words, it is able to perceive the elements which are invisible within the dominant order. Following Alain Badiou, a revolutionary organization seeks to reorder things so that certain invisible elements can have a real existence in the world. That would be the extrinsic definition of such an organization. But intrinsically, a revolutionary organization must also be composed in such a way that it can perceive the invisible elements in the first place. Often this means that its members, the individuals within it, may themselves belong to like a marginalized social class. And it means also that they must have some degree of power and visibility within this organization that they wouldn't have outside of it. It takes work to create such conditions which do not exist in the outside world. However, in order to be effective and have a certain power over the world, organizations must eventually interact with the systems of that world. It has to develop sub-organizations or subsystems, what Alain Badiou calls organs, that are suited for talking to the outside world, to the outside systems. These organs cannot be completely intrinsically determined, since they must be able to share information with the outside world. Therefore, these organs may develop according to some fragment of the very logic that the organization itself is trying to change. This leads us to the most difficult moment in any revolutionary organization, when it recognizes that it may also be reproducing certain aspects of the dominant order within itself. Another way to formulate this problem is along the idea of scale. In order to affect the structures of society, a revolutionary organization must scale up to the level of these structures. But how does a revolutionary organization scale without completely conceding to the external world and its logic of accumulating power, violence, and so on? Anyone who claims to be a materialist today cannot escape this problem. It's likely that in most cases, especially on the left, there are intrinsic determinations which serve as the limiting factors to scaling. An organization might seek to change the capitalist order, for example, but if it does not have proper economic organs, it will fail. We cannot effectively change what we don't see properly. An economic system like a climate system is generally too vast to perceive locally. The question becomes, what sort of instruments are needed to capture the global features of these systems? One paradigmatic example of this would be the national transition to communism, which is essentially a scaling problem. Leftist movements have stalled on this problem for a century, leading to all sorts of divisions. But rather than take these splits within a revolutionary movement as simple failures, or to rely on obscurantist traps regarding human nature, we should consider them as experiments with competing hypotheses about the proper sensibility at stake. Even failed experiments yield valuable information. Any hypothesis can be formulated as being about a constraint on the behavior of some system. We can further divide constraints into those of each of the terms in the triad that we mentioned earlier: dynamics, interaction, and composition. A dynamical constraint is one which does not allow certain changes to occur in an organization. The most obvious kind would be those imposed by nature or physical laws. So here I have an example of a physical system, which is a pendulum that is affected by gravity, right? And we can see two pictures of this system. One is the actual pendulum on the left, and on the right, we have what's called a phase diagram, or the phase space of the system. So that shows on one axis the angular velocity, and on the other one, the position of this pendulum. And we can see that this system converges to a single point, right? This is called the fixed point of this dynamical system. Here is an example of a natural system, right? So for example, an organization is limited in its productivity by the constraints of energy resources available to it. But more interesting are those constraints that an organization imposes on itself. For example, an anti-racist organization does not tolerate racism within its ranks. Revolutionary organizations are constrained in ways which reflect the new order they seek to establish, but this is often rife with ambiguity. As we've discussed earlier, underneath the prescriptive level lies certain unconscious or ideological constraints that need to be explored. An organization might very well find that its members mostly belong to the same race, or find that power is unevenly distributed within among the different races, even though explicitly it is open to all races. In the same way that one needs a device with certain properties to detect the electric field, an organization may not have the proper organ to detect racism, even within itself. And if it cannot interact with this phenomenon internally, then we should not expect it to interact productively with the same phenomenon in the outside world. Another example of a dynamical system is more interesting, actually. This is a Lorentz system. And unlike the previous one, which, the pendulum loses energy and eventually stops, a Lorentz system continues, but it has a structure which is defined by these these holes inside of the system. As you can see, they kind of revolve around these points, which are called attractors. So these are the kinds of systems that we want to be understanding, I think, because they exhibit some structure, but they're not so short-lived. And I think the goal is to try to imagine this for social reality as well, right? If we think about a simple example like the production cycle of a company, taking labor in and materials and producing goods for exchange. This would be a system that resembles something more like a Lorentz system than the pendulum example previously. So another dynamical constraint concerns the issues of social reproduction and the allocation of resources. In a capitalist world, firms are constrained by competition. Jobs are outsourced to other countries not because of individual greed, but because companies would fall to their competitors if they did not outsource. But these constraints are not natural. They are outcomes of political decisions. Cooperation can transform the constraints on single individuals into new constraints on a group with a far more optimal outcome. The work of the economist Elinor Ostrom is important here. She observes that what is termed the tragedy of the commons is not an inevitable outcome, right? The tragedy of the commons being when many appropriators share the same resource, but no one owns it. And therefore, there's nothing that can stop one person from overusing that resource, right? Our general climate is an example. The air around us, the water, these are commons. Elinor Ostrom's work is really important because she shows that even with traditional game theoretic approaches in economics, we can model how cooperation can actually is superior to, let's say, individualist approaches to these commons. So there are many historical instances where resources are successfully governed according to a logic that is neither the state nor the market. Ostrom outlines certain design principles common to these examples And these principles ensure that the rewards and costs of a common good are properly internalized and allocated. When discussing constraints in general, it is important to consider how one measures the constraint. A capitalist world measures value in terms of commodities, and ultimately in terms of how much surplus a set of commodities can produce. Because of this, its region of optimization is very narrow. A revolutionary organization can leverage new ways of measuring, drawing upon ideas in art and philosophy. Organizations need to experiment with measures to find those with the proper characteristics. And this is a process which can inherently transform dynamic constraints. The third example of dynamics here is what's called an epigenetic landscape. So if you imagine a gene developing, right, in our bodies, this biologist, Waddington, tried to envision it as a ball rolling down a hill. And based on the contours of this hill, right, the space that it has to traverse, the same gene might express different characteristics, going one way or the other. So I think this is a nice way to think about how the system of constraints on an organization develops over time, right? We've talked about the problem that an organization, in order to scale up, has to develop certain capabilities to interact with the outside world. So these capabilities can be seen as kind of dependent on the path that this organization takes in its development. So next, there are constraints on interaction. When an organization interacts, it does so within an environment that can be viewed as its own system. This interaction is a type of connection. And since we've said that a revolutionary organization produces novel connections, it must interact in new ways. But generally speaking, this interaction will be antagonistic, since a social world may have mechanisms that seek to preserve its existing structure. Antagonistic interactions can become destructive, leading to a loss of effectiveness for the revolutionary organization. This is why Badiou tries to separate subtraction from destruction, which is another important topic. When thinking about constraints on interaction for revolutionary organizations, we can basically boil it down to the constraints of which battles to fight in a given conjuncture or combination of situations. On the other hand, there is also the question of to what extent revolutionary organizations should work within existing structures. To what extent should it participate in the economy or in state mechanisms? How should it ally itself with communities which may not have the same revolutionary fervor? The answer we propose is that it depends on the extent to which the revolutionary organization can become an environment for these existing structures. And there's a subtlety here that is difficult to demarcate, which is how the same interaction, a financial transaction, for example, can have a different significance and different consequences depending on where it takes place. If the constraints of the outside world govern that interaction, then the revolutionary organization is in a position of compromise, right? It has to accept the constraints from the outside world. In other words, as long as the constraints come from within the organization, then it should participate as much as possible with these external structures. Finally, there are constraints on composition, which is also relevant to the previous question. A revolutionary organization does not appear ex nihilo, but rather is an assemblage of existing fragments of the world. Each such fragment is composed of other fragments. The principle which directs this composition is also a matter of experimentation. What makes an organization revolutionary is precisely that this composition is not given beforehand, but emerges in the course of development. In that sense, these constraints are purely political, even when it consists of things obeying physical laws, right? What is political is how we connect these things, not the things themselves necessarily. So such an organization serves as a lens to view a new type of connection in the world. This means it becomes a kind of resource for its members, and even those who are not its members. Simply put, before the revolution, it was impossible to connect certain elements, but afterwards it becomes possible. A clear example of this can be found in the queer movement. The basic hypothesis is that sexuality is not reducible to biology alone. Notice that this is a negative definition. It does not specify what sexuality is, nor does it aim to. What is important is that this movement creates new connections between people, new possibilities of love and family composition, which previously did not exist or had to stay invisible. Its revolutionary character is not epistemological, but it regards the legal, cultural, and economic constraints on queer people. In summary, we can view revolutionary organizations as processes which are exploring the constraints of a world, and through this exploration also develops new ways to detect and share phenomenological information. I'd like to end this talk by discussing the concept of ecology from the perspective we've developed. It is apparent that there is not only one political movement happening today. We have seen many local struggles finding resonance in other parts of the world, most often facilitated by the internet and other emerging technologies. Yet how do we produce connections between movements that are not simply limited to individuals recognizing and allying themselves to these movements? This is again a question of materialism, which is finding a new articulation. My group and I, SDP, which has been studying these questions for a long time now, we're very interested in the notion of resource sharing, which is currently being developed in the applied mathematics community as a basis for forming robust connections between organizations. The basic intuition here is that rather than relying on mutual recognition or allyship between individuals, we emphasize the actual systems that multiple movements rely on. This entails that revolutionary work includes the production of new shared systems, as well as to rebuild or maintain existing ones. These systems serve as the connective tissue for organizations, allowing us to stitch together new movements from existing ones. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Denis. That was really intense, actually. And I'm sure that all of us have questions and maybe comments and everything. So we were thinking, Aline and I, that the best way to organize our discussion today is to drop your name or your question in the chat box, so we can keep the order also into consideration. So if you have a question, just write it in the chat box, or just type your name and we will call it. Okay, so I can start with a warm-up question. Could you please give us more examples, like from reality, on like revolutionary organizations? Do you think it is something that is existent, or something that like just supposed?
Yeah, so I think any movement that is trying to establish the existence of some marginalized class is revolutionary on some level. So I gave the example of the queer movement, but of course there's anti-racist movements, right? In the United States, we had a movement called the Black Panthers. in the 20th century. That's a good example. Today we have the Black Lives Matter movement. I would say the struggle against Israel's occupation is obviously one of the most tense examples of revolution, right? In terms of the people who are colonized are left invisible. They don't count in the system. So any movement which tries to make individuals count that normally don't count, that's revolutionary. But how effective an organization is in doing that, that's what I'm I think trying to understand, right? What makes a revolutionary organization effective or not in establishing that, and can we think of ways to make it more effective in some cases? I think Malak might have.
Yeah, I think Malak's internet connection might have gone down. Are there any questions that anyone wants to raise?
I just want, it's Mun here. I just want Denis to elaborate on a point that he mentioned when he was finishing his presentation regarding the idea of like creating connections between certain groups or organizations. And then you stated that it's not usually apparent, like this kind of allyship is not apparent, like you can't see it. So can you elaborate on this idea a little bit?
Yeah, so of course it's very important to have allyship, and that is a way to make things visible in the political world, right? The more people that support a movement, the more likely it is to become visible. But I think there is an upper limit to this effectivity when it comes to things like the state or structures of power that don't necessarily see individual allyship as a threat. Basically, they don't see it as something that necessarily affects them, right? A capitalist company thinks only about profits. So allyship is not, I mean, companies can also be allies. We see this all the time. It can become a marketing strategy. So from the phenomenological standpoint, what does it mean to make a movement seen or to have an effect on capitalist structures? It means to affect the profit line of companies, for example. So actually a great example is BDS, right? I think the logic of BDS is to affect the economic lifeline of Israel, for example, or in the United States, we have many strikes happening today, fights for increased wages or work stoppages that are increasing. And I think this is an example of disrupting these systems at a more basic level.
And we have a question from Zaid. Can you see it, Denis, in the chat box?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. So one question is, how does corruption make revolutionary organizations less effective? Yeah, so for me, I think corruption is a problem, but I think it is, we should not be too caught up in focusing on corruption, because in the end, what matters is what the organization is able to do. So I think there's this cycle that we get into with electoral politics and with choosing leaders and then having those leaders let us down sometimes, right? But I think this is maybe the wrong way to approach changing society, because these leaders are only able to do what the system allows them to do, right? And what they're allowed to do is dependent on what the system is able to perceive in social reality. So I think by making new aspects of social reality visible and present to these systems of power, that is how you can force change, right? So there's many ways to do that, but I think corruption is only a symptom of not having the right resolution to see certain social phenomena. Also, yeah, someone said this is a very weak understanding of revolution. So I welcome that comment. Like, please, I'd like to debate that if you have any more elaboration. And the next question is, I am thinking about the idea of tools to see what does not already exist. I believe art can be one tool, but then if individual and collectives will derive different possibilities. Can you talk more about the limits in an individual practice that could be shared, such as a work of art, and collective practice? Yeah, I think art has a very interesting place because it is about sensibility, right? Art is about inventing new forms of sensibility that that has relevance for political struggle. Because if you cannot express new aspects of social reality, which might be very complex and not suited for individual, not suited for us as individuals, right? We can't see something like the economy. We can't see necessarily all the violence that the state perpetrates on people. So I think art has a place in making this visible at an individual level, which is really important. And the limits of this are, again, that ultimately, in order to make your revolutionary organization visible, you need to create these organs or subsystems that can interact with the outside world. So this includes, like affecting the profits of companies, affecting the territory of a state, right? Occupying land is one of the ways that marginalized people have fought against state power, because the state sees land. The state sees land, so when you occupy that land, you get its attention. And so, like, art has a limit because it doesn't reach the certain levels of resolution.
I think Blake has a question.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Denis. So considering you were talking about Badiou, so for Badiou, the affect of politics for Badiou is enthusiasm, right? Mm-hmm. And Badiou in Logics of Worlds says, okay, so what is it about politics that produces enthusiasm? And it's this axis of confidence and terror, right? Mm-hmm. So for Badiou, it seems that a revolutionary organization provides the people, is what he says, with the confidence to be violent, right? And I just wonder, because it's like within this kind of terrain of like navigating different allyships and stuff like that, it sounds like this, like these kind of systems of allies and groupings that that we have to touch upon all these like questions with it. It sounds like we're more in a kind of state situation from Badiou's perspective. It seems like we're dealing with mm-hmm. the management of state, right? So I just wonder if you can respond to that, because considering it is you're posing this as an experimental framework, and specifically in Badu's work, when we're dealing with experience, we're in the realm of affect, and the affect of politics is enthusiasm, which is produced through confidence in terror for him. I wonder if you could maybe talk about how maybe you're going against Badu, or you see your project as working with Badu, or how you navigate that part of his corpus with what you're working on.
Yeah, so dense question. Yeah, it's really good though. Yeah, so again, I think enthusiasm, confidence in the people, these are important, right? You can almost say that enthusiasm for me, in what I've presented, is a type of measure of how visible an organization is. So if you're able to inspire people to become engaged, to participate, or to think about these problems, you have achieved a level of visibility in the world. And this is objective, right? This is not like a purely subjective theory. This is, we can see enthusiasm in the body count of people who participate in a protest, for example, or who talk about the events. There's like activity. However, again, there's a limit to this, I think. And I think, I don't think I'm going against Badu here. I think I'm just talking about ways that we can extend this to non-predicative forms. So let me back up a second. I think that the state has kind of a box that it puts everyone in, right? This box is formed by its data collection, its surveillance, and its understanding of individuals and their preferences. So your political identity and all the connections you have with different movements, the state can see that, right? I mean, it probably doesn't react to that because there's so much data, but the state perceives individual allyship. What I would say is more effective or more interesting to me is, what if we can combine human and non-human parts together in such a way that it exceeds the predicates of the system, right? The power of data is only as great as the predicates you have to slice up that data, to say, like, this is what I consider to be a threat, or this is what I consider to be a good citizen. These are predicates that are human. They're not defined by machines. They're defined by politics. You define what a good citizen is, and then you use data to kind of create that categorization. And I'm saying that what we should be doing, or what we should be thinking about at least, is creating forms of organization that that count as noise in these systems, that don't fall under any clear demarcation according to the state. And it is and we're already doing this. I mean, political movements do this all the time, right? There's the boundaries of when a movement starts and when individuals start, like the boundaries between movements and individuals is very fuzzy. And so I'm saying we should be using that fuzziness to our advantage. Hopefully that answers that question. And
thank you, Denis. Yeah, Blake, if you have any comment, could you please hold on so we deal with as much questions as possible. So we have a question from Ilaria. Can you reach it, Denis? It's in the chat box.
Oh, okay, yeah. Oh, here's one. Yeah. I have a question. Can art institutions be considered as a form of revolutionary organization with their own set of constraints? Yes, I think so. How could this be addressed in respect to what you said in terms of impossibility to operate outside prefixed variables inherited from previous organizational systems? Yeah, exactly. That falls very well with the earlier question of, I think art invents new forms of sensibility, and these new forms of sensibility exceed what other organizations are able to see. So this, in the previous question, we're talking about this fuzzy boundary between people and things that exceeds the capacity for the state or for systems of control to understand what's going on. Art has a central place there, because art is what makes new forms out of that fuzziness. So I think it has a very crucial role to play. But does it have its own set of constraints? Yes, art is also commodified in this world. It is also subject to external pressures as to what types of art get created, right? Maybe less so if you're an individual artist, but certainly at a larger level, if you're starting to, mass produce certain art, or you want to reach a larger audience, then, for example, like a film, it's hard to make a film about political struggle unless it's like struggle from 50 or 100 years ago. And usually when if you see like a Hollywood movie about like a revolution, like Russian Revolution, for example, it's going to be watered down heavily, right? Because the form that the art takes must fit a certain preconception in order for it to be financially successful. So that would be like a constraint on art, that at a large scale, it starts to conform to the outside world. So finding ways outside of that is also a very important part of the struggle, I think. Next question is, my question has to do with the observation that any organization assumes a shared space in which to organize. What is the effect or limit of our inherited spaces or environments in which we organize, urban, rural, etc., especially to your point about the paradox of scale? Yeah, so this is a really important topic in our group, which is the passage from local to global, right? Just to get, jump right to it, I think like we have this thing called the internet, and it's supposed to create these this kind of non-local form of communication, right? You don't need to be in a particular location to connect with other people, but capital has already kind of seized that onto that and kind of carved it up into different sectors, right? So now you have to use these platforms, or you don't have to, but it's common to use these platforms to conduct our communications. So that is a problem, right? That means there are constraints on forms of organization that come from the platforms we use, on the one hand. On the other hand, yeah, so shared space is really important, like creating a space such as this conference or this workshop is incredibly important, because you need to be able to bring people together that don't necessarily share some kind of common credentials or understanding of things, right? Like you shouldn't need a PhD or a degree to talk about philosophy, right? And yet there are so few spaces where that is something that happens, right? So there are constraints not only on our free time to study these things, but constraints on the spaces themselves. Like, we're limited by how much we can go into these topics because we don't have time to delve into it. And yeah, I think that's all I have to say on that point. But I think there's a lot more about scale that should be discussed. So, okay, next question. Okay, so this is the polemic one, right? According to your understanding of revolution, would you say an organization like Hezbollah or Hamas count as revolutionary? I say yes, it does count, but it's not effective sometimes because violence only gets so far. For an entity like Israel or an entity like the United States, violence is par for the course. It is something that the state is very comfortable with seeing, right? So yes, you do achieve a certain visibility with violence. You get on the map, so to speak, but my question is it worth the cost? Because obviously the military of the United States and the funding of the United States will make it very hard to sustain any kind of military campaign, and it only gets so far as creating new forms of sensibility. You are fitting within existing parameters of violence, right? And I think what we should be thinking about instead is maybe different forms of violence, like violence in terms of carving up social space in a new way, thinking of social space in a way that doesn't fit existing parameters. I think this is more effective as a long-term strategy. So Yasha's question, those interested in the idea of mentioned, okay, it's a promotion of Rodrigo Nunez's book, Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal. This is a really important book that we've been discussing. The next question is,
can we have Ali's question, because he's saying that he has a question. Oh yeah, he just dropped it down. Sorry, I didn't notice. Okay.
So yeah, this resonates quite a lot with corporate logic of marketing. The more visible you are, the better. The state and the market seek to render everything as visible as possible. So yeah, your identity, to be a subject, you have to have a face. You have to be, by both market and the state. I completely agree with that. The constantly self-subjectifying citizen is the ideal citizen, away from any sense of collectivity or assemblage. The only instance of organization allows for is allyship. Yes, I agree, which is based on a negativity that is personal victimhood. Sometimes, yeah. This means that the subject, which, to quote Deleuze here, is quite literally a black hole of negativity that swallows any potentiality of becoming different, is indispensable. Yeah, I mean, definitely, I think this falls into the previous point, which is it's not about how visible you are. We're not saying be more visible as a person, as an individual. I think what is more potent as a revolutionary strategy is to make assemblages visible, new assemblages that don't fall under the category of individual or company or political organization the way that it's recognized today. It's to create something that it's also very visible, but it's something that from the perspective of the state is a question mark. It's something like, we don't know what it is exactly. This is powerful because when the state does not know what this form is, it causes the categories that it tries to interact with it to change. It cannot interact with it in the same ways. Whereas if you're just an individual, the state knows how to deal with you as an individual. It can silence you. It can make you disappear in some cases. It can discredit you, right? These are tactics that work against individuals. But if you create a movement or you create a group whose boundaries are hard to define within the existing system, then that's a different question. Yeah, how can we think about politics and the binary between visible and invisible? Yeah, I think this is relevant also. Like this, it's all about carving up social reality into categories that we can then organize and control. Right? And then when I say we, I mean like the state, the neoliberal system, and so on. These are governance is about carving up space into categories and then controlling those categories using basically control systems. It can be automated systems, but they can also be just systems of law, legal systems, economic systems. And yeah, how do we transform that is, that's what we're interested in, right? To transform that means to first exceed that predicative power, and then to invent new forms of sensibility that give us leverage over these systems. How can we understand whoever tries to be part of the revolutionary organization for his own benefit? We see it from individuals. Yeah. So yeah, opportunism, that is also important, because not for a moral reason. Like, I don't think, it doesn't matter to me if someone is opportunistic as an individual. What matters is if that is counterproductive to what the organization is trying to establish. I think, yeah, I mean, it's a difficult question, but I think that organizations want to leverage people's enthusiasm, and there will always be opportunists. But the point is to create the constraints so that those opportunists are not dictating the goals of the organization, right? Organizations should not be vehicles for the expression of individuals. If it becomes that, then yeah, then it's no longer, it's easily definable again. It falls into the same category of, this is just an individual that is manipulating other people and so on. But I would also say, like, ideologically, this is a common tactic to paint organizations as being corrupted, right? Like, even if the organization is still effective, the state will have an incentive to paint it as like, oh, this is just a personality cult. This is just one person trying to use it as for their own gains. But this is, I would say, mapping a higher level phenomena to the individual level once again, right? There's an incentive for those in power to take collective movements and reduce them down to individuals just seeking their own personal benefit, because it makes people stop believing that collective organizations are real, right? It makes us cynical. So I would say resist that as well, because that is just another form of control. Okay, Judith Butler's idea of historicity of performance. Yeah, new actions and bodies, new materialities or beings are possible, and how indigenous communities take on account and live with realities that seem unreal for us, but they do live with and around them. I definitely think that, especially this last point, that the indigenous communities, they are able to teach us a lot about social reality in a new way, right? We think that social reality is what we see every day, which is the commodified universe. But I think indigenous communities have something, have things that exceed that frame of reference, right? That if you look at the way that indigenous communities treat their environment, it is not something that they're just extracting from or commodifying or parceling out to private owners. That's extremely important to have a different paradigm. But yeah, again, there is even that, though, I think there's a limit, because indigenous communities are seen by the state in a particular way, and the goal is to, the last point in the talk, which is about ecology, I think is about connecting these different indigenous communities, for example, in new ways. So in some sense, we are all kind of suffering from the extraction from the environment, extraction from social reality. So it's a way to connect new connections between these movements. But I'm not sure I answered that one. I might have to think about it some more. The next one, the fact that you said an organization like Hezbollah is revolutionary, which is honestly shocking, makes you blind to the distinction between revolutionary and counter-revolutionary. You went on to discuss effectiveness, but that's besides the point. Hezbollah, much like Khalij capital, is one of the most counter-revolutionary forces in the Middle East, oppressing movements in Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. Hence the weakness of your definition, etc. Yeah, but I didn't say in an unqualified way that they're revolutionary. I meant to say that the counter-revolutionary quality of movements does not preclude that they are trying to make something visible in the world. It's actually not about their personal intentions at all, but what is effective in the world. Effectiveness is the core of what I'm trying to, it is the primary measurement. So in order to say, if you say like, the one group is counter-revolutionary because they intend to squash revolution, versus this other one is revolutionary because they intend to let's say, do something good, make a good change to reality. I think this is still caught up in the discourse of individual intentions. What matters is what is the effect of these organizations. They want to produce a new type of visibility, and Hezbollah does do that. It creates a new visibility. But I just think that in some cases the effectiveness of that strategy might be called into question. But that's not to say that it's not revolutionary. But yeah, it's a good question though.
Thank you for your point about noise and fuzziness. I thought it was really interesting. I work in the culture industry, as Emily knows, and I find it very difficult to sort of transcend the structures of the culture, the dynamics of the culture industry, because even now as we try to sort of, diversify, these categories are very defined, right? It's like transgender, it's like person of BIPOC, it's like queer, and so on. And it becomes really, actually, instead of being a liberating act, when we put somebody in a category, it tends to have the opposite effect. And unfortunately, the funding and also the organizing of cultural work revolves around these categories. For example, if you want to have a festival for indigenous voices, right? And you only amplify indigenous artists, it's going to be problematic, and there's going to be a lot of protest around that, but also you're going to fundraise for that specific cause. And then that's going to come, as you mentioned earlier, with censorship, right? Especially with Palestine, there's always a line. Every single cultural institution I've worked with, and media institution, has drawn the line for Palestine and indigenous rights. That's the line we don't cross. So how are we doing liberating work then, or liberation work, if we're actually being, censoring ourselves all the time, being censored by all these categories and all these dynamics that really mirror, the dynamics of, capitalism, fascism, all these things. The militant complex, of course.
This is probably maybe the most important question is like the distinction between an organization within the capitalist universe, within the environment that we're in today, versus an organization that can become the environment for other organizations. So I think this is, I don't have a great answer to say when that happens. But this is an interest of our group, which is, if you think about the earlier point of constraints, right? You mentioned censorship is a type of constraint that you have to deal with when organizing. So this is a constraint that's passed on to you from the outside world. So, but why is it that the outside world has the power to give constraints to us? I think it's because we depend on them in order, we have certain material dependencies on these environments, right? Just like we need water, we need food, we need air. These are dependencies, and because we need those things, we respect the constraints of the environment. Or I mean, in the case of individuals, we do, but in the case of the state or companies, they don't need to breathe, right? So they don't, like, companies don't need to drink water, so they don't care about the quality of water. Individuals care about the quality of water. So we respect those constraints. So yeah, when it comes to censorship, I think the question is, can we invent forms that no longer need what the environment is giving us, or can we give ourselves the things that we need? So platforms, the creation of new platforms, the creation of new audiences. That should be, I think, the goal. But it's, I mean, it's very daunting, like how, you know, it seems like a chicken or egg problem when it comes to cultural production, because how do you have a voice? You depend on existing systems to get the voice in the first place. But I guess I would say is those of us who already have a platform need to be consolidating that and not giving it away, right? Because that platform is the maybe the seeds of a new type of environment for cultural production.
I just wanted to say that if anyone of you has a question now, just feel free to jump in and just ask it, you know. And I'm sure that a question and answer is never enough, because each answer produces like other questions. So if you want to elaborate more, or like to, you know, ask him about more details, just feel free to jump in. Okay, so I guess I have, I was actually a little bit concerned about the verb senses that you use from the first minute I started translating your abstract, because you use the verb senses, you know, to establish the relationship between the organization and the production. So you have mentioned, you said that the capitalist firm or the organization senses production. And for me, I know that you, you know, explained what you mean by this word, but is it a kind of epistemological approach, epistemological relationship? Because also when we say like the organization senses production in that way, there is a presupposition that production precedes the organization, and it just comes and senses it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, you're right. Production is, it's not like production is some neutral thing that was already happening, and then the capitalist company comes in and senses it. It actively changes the thing that it senses, right? I mean, I think this gets us to deep questions about the nature of, let's say, what Marx called primitive accumulation, right? At what point, if you think of capital as a grain of sand, you know, at what point did it become, you know, capitalism proper? At what point was it able to not only sense labor, but to now like control it and to extract from it and transform it into what it has become today? Yeah, I think it is more complicated than that. But sensibility, I don't think, is an epistemological category. It is phenomenological. So it's a different, it is about the logic of appearances. So we derive a lot of this from Alain Badu's work, especially his second big book called Logics of Worlds. In that work, it's all about establishing the implication, which is like logical implication, which is appropriate to a given set of appearances. So to give an example, like gravity is a force in nature. It affects physical bodies. So we can derive a logical implication. If you drop a ball, it will fall to the floor. That's a type of logical conclusion that we would accept. But gravity doesn't affect something like a country or value, right? Gravity doesn't affect a commodity per se. It's on a different plane, right? So what are the logical structures that are appropriate to talk about commodities, for example? This is where I think we're getting into a political economy, because those structures are the outcome of politics. They're not natural structures. And the point is to study them so that we can change them. So there's also another distinction between theories for us as individuals. So how can we personally understand capital? But then there's this experimentation of organizations which are actually trying to alter this space. I think I'm trying to put more emphasis on the latter, where an organization might try to, let's say, create a cooperative, taking a group of workers and organizing them differently according to different principles. This is an experiment that hopes to learn something about production that capitalism has forgotten or capitalism ignores, right? Which is all about cooperation and connecting, forming new relationships between production and the outside environment. Yeah, I don't know. I think, but you're totally right that when you sense something, a lot of times you can't help but to also interact and change that thing. The question is whether the change you are performing on that thing is strong enough to break the existing logic that this thing is operating within.
Yeah, thank you. I think that was clear enough. Does anyone else have any question, or should I ask my next question? Okay, so I was also thinking about the example that you gave on the queer movement as a revolutionary movement, because Marx and Deleuze have also something else to say about that, because in different ways, their point is that capitalism all the time is able to recapitalize these kind of escaping attempts. For example, for Marx, it's in the way of commodifying this issue. For Deleuze, he looks at LGBTQ society as a kind of attempt to break the binaries, like the capitalist system or any authoritarian system works through. Breaking the binary between the man and woman. But again, this kind of deterritorialization will re-territorialize in another binary or with other binaries. So for them, these attempts are re-included in the capitalist system again. I don't know, is the revolutionary something that should have consistency, or like, I mean, it should last as long as the thing that they revolt against is there? Or any attempt, any revolutionary attempt in any moment is revolutionary?
Yeah. Yeah, stability of the systems that are created are really important, right? We want it to be a revolution. In order to be successful, needs to create some kind of new stability, new stable orbits. If you imagine that pendulum diagram, like or actually the next one, right? You want to be able to orbit continuously around a new point instead of the old one. I would say, yeah, I mean, revolutionary movements, they come up, they come into the social reality, they reconfigure it, but that is not the new reality is not the revolutionary movement itself. The movement itself is what is reconfiguring reality, and that comes from within social reality, from the invisible sector of that reality. So in Alain Badiou's work, there's this concept of the site of the event and so on, but we don't need to use that. We could just simply say that as long as there are invisible elements in a situation that are charged subjectively in some way, that the revolution can reappear again as a force from within the situation to kind of reconfigure things. Yeah. I think there's a question in the chat here. Social experience is an intersubjectifying experience where individualities are transcended and transformed through debate, persuasion, and public exchange of arguments into collective yet subversive subject. If that is the case, how will the phenomenological approach help us understand the politics within the constraints of being visible, always for the politics of governance? Always for the politics of governance. Oh, okay, so in the sense of there are still constraints on what types of subjective experiences are allowed, perhaps. Yeah, so here my answer is that we have this social space to debate, discuss things, to think together, right? And it's very important for us to preserve that. There is always an attempt by systems of control to take those interactions and reduce them to simple categories. But I think that these subjectifying experiences, these ways of participating in new ways, they exceed these categories. So the phenomenological approach allows us to see or think about new ways of sensibility, new types of sensibility that we can take as valid. In the beginning of the talk, I talked about like revolutionary movements. Sometimes we can't measure how much they change reality. They might appear and then disappear, and then we think, okay, it didn't do anything, like they failed. They didn't succeed in changing reality. No laws were written. There was no like overthrow of the government or something like that. It was just the revolutionary movement showed up and disappeared, right? But we can see the trace of this movement in the people that participated, right? They were subjectified in some new way. If you ever have been a part of a movement, or if you've ever seen someone, talk to someone who has been in a movement, there was something about it that was irreducible, right? Not even if the movement itself disappears, it left a mark on them. this is proof that something happened. But it is often like, you can then also see the way the state responds by kind of recasting that experience as being, just opportunism, like the previous question. It was just opportunism. It was just people being lazy, or it was just a riot or something like that. So it's always important to connect these experiences and keep them as an important resource for us, right? We need to preserve them, just like we need to preserve our natural resources, the air and the water that we need to survive. We need to preserve the subjective experiences that that emerged in these movements. But again, there's a limit to just preserving it, right? We can make all the songs and music and all the movies we want about a revolutionary movement that happened, but it's not going to necessarily be enough to sustain the next movement. So there's a limitation there. And I think it has everything to do with phenomenology. Like, what did we invent a new type of sensibility, or is this sensibility simply reducible to the individuals that participated in the movement?
I think we can take another question before we finish. If not, okay, so I was also thinking.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hello.
Hello.
This is not hey, excuse my nervousness in talking to strangers, but this is not so much a question, but more of an observation. I've been living in Greece for 2 years, and they have tools and systems that basically have been used for some time. Like, they have the synelefsi, which is the demonstration within the squats. They have assemblies basically that happen maybe 3 times a week. And in my participation, like kind of at arm's length, I've noticed there's kind of been a delusion in the aesthetic of revolution, where these tools that are sound, like assemblies, communication, voicing concerns, they've almost lost the point of why it started, like the original settings. So let's say, like, on a practical level, these tools are established in the West and in places where they're not established, like assemblies, buildings that basically allow for facilities for people who need to do shit. Like, what do we do to, I guess the question I ask people around me is like, what do we do to keep ourselves in check? Like, if we have established tools, practically, how do we keep it up to date? Like, even philosophically, the discourses that are spoken about within the assemblies are like 20 years in the past. And it's crazy to me, because they have these spaces to actually participate, but they don't. It's become an alternative. It's like playing in a band or participating in an art team, basically, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So how do we take care, from the context of being here in a practical position, how do we take care as a community in spaces on different lands that we don't fall into basically aesthetic and into a routine that loses the plot? Because everything is so theoretical, and I see the practicality of what has been applied here, and I'm like, okay, so it's possible to sort of lose yourself and just get stuck in the lifestyle of politics. And do you know what I'm saying? Am I making sense?
I think so. Yeah, I think this is everything to do with what the main reason I'm interested in this whole approach, all this crazy science stuff and theoretical abstract stuff that I'm trying to utilize. It's about breaking us out of the individualist capture of political discourse. Like,
100%.
Yeah, the reason we keep going in cycles about like, we base our identities on these political movements, and then when we base our identities on them, it's very easy. It's easy to live. It's easier to live that way because the world is meant to be lived in by individuals, right? I mean, capitalism, whatever you want to call it, the state, capitalism, the nation, they're all structures that try to, they're like a gravity, they create gravity so that all discourses collapse onto an individual level, right? So you have these moments of collective enthusiasm, moments when something new appears, but we should always be aware of this gravity, this gravitational force, which will collapse that onto the individual again. And once it collapses onto the individual, it becomes stable. It becomes a stable system that revolves around lifestyle choices. It revolves around who's allied with who, who's the next upcoming revolutionary idea or fad. And also, we should be aware of the cynicism that is part of that, right? We see it happening, but that also doesn't mean we are allowed to be cynical about all possibilities in the future, because that's also the same trap, right? What I'm looking for in all of this non-human systems, right, natural systems, I'm looking for what is a way to invent a new type of stability which involves people and things in a way that will not collapse to individualism again. And I think sensibility is a good way to approach that idea, because how do you measure if you're falling into the old trap or the new trap? It's if you're able to sense something new in social reality or not. If you're only an individual, then all you can sense is other people. Who's a good person? Who's a bad person? Who's your friend? Who's your foe? Who's the good politician or the bad politician? Like, these are categories of the individual that fit our social, the social reality of today. But what if we created new categories that are not about people, or more about types of organizations, new types of organizations that explore different aspects of society? I think that, yeah, I don't know. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Okay, so Aline is asking us to finish. Thank you so much, Denis, and thank you everyone for your attendance and for your participation in this very important discussion. That was amazing, actually, and everything you've said, all of you, has just left us with more questions and references to explore, and I'm sure that we will be like obsessed with many of the points that have been mentioned today. That's it. Thank you so much. I'm not sure if Aline wants to add anything.
No, I just want to thank you, Malak and Denis, for joining us and giving your time, and everyone that participated with your questions. And not to forget that we have 2 more sessions as part of the Revolution Philosophy seminars. There's one this Friday with Adam Bartlett at 12 o'clock at noon Palestine time. And then the 3rd session on Monday with Rebecca Comey. If anyone had any trouble receiving the links, please email us and we'll send you any adjusted links and so on.
Yeah, it's been a true pleasure. Thank you all.